Hi everyone, my name is Ludovic Rigali. I'm a professor at NYU. I'm here, I'm replacing Martial Herbert. He was not able to come today, so we'll be chairing this session. So our next speaker is Céline Pieters. She was the first student, well, she was the student who worked with Jean-Paul, a PhD student, when Jean-Paul started to work on rhetoric and robotics. So I guess you're going to show us how Jean-Paul was a complete scientist who really was looking at very different things. So Céline is a postdoctoral researcher in rhetoric at the University of Vienna, and she still works on the philosophy of media and technology. And she did her PhD thesis jointly at INRIA, at INSA in Toulouse and at the Université Libre of Brussels in Belgium, and you did most of your PhD thesis at the last CNRS, surrounded by roboticists. And so today you're going to talk to us about what does it mean to talk about machines, and I'm very much looking forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I will myself start with an introduction that Jean-Paul especially liked when we would present our work together. So this is about the well-known roboticist Ruzena Bakshi, who during an interview in 2010 explained the motivations of her research on active perception in robotics, which she started in 1983. In that interview, she highlighted the fact that as humans, we don't just see, we look, we don't just touch, we feel. At this time, she was concerned with improving robots' visual perception, and she used this analogy with humans to support the idea that if a machine could adapt actively to the scene around it, its perception of the environment would be considerably ameliorated. She specified, being human, our pupils adjust to the level of illumination, our eyes bring the world into sharp focus, we move our heads or change our position to get a better view of something, and these features have a direct impact on our knowledge of the world. So now the question is, when such human behaviors, or more generally, when living organisms' behaviors are simulated on machines, and that it works, of course, can we then say that a robot looks and not just sees anymore? That the robot feels and doesn't just touch? In the fields of robotics and artificial intelligence, many words and expressions that form our representations of robots are borrowed from the vocabulary of the living. So we talk about intelligent machines, autonomous robots, moral agents, and we say that the robots learn, they decide, robots know, they want, they feel, etc. And those words seem to challenge humans' perception and understanding of robots. But what do we really mean when we use these words when talking about robots? This is the problematic that gathered Jean-Paul and I for a 3 years PhD program at the last CNRS in Toulouse between 2017 and 2020. Or at least it's a question that started this common research, because at the end we didn't look at what these words mean exactly. So we didn't engage in a search for accurate definitions for those words, and we didn't aim to establish if it is or not appropriate to use such a vocabulary when we talk about robots and the discipline of robotics in general. So our objective was rather to better understand what we do when we talk about robots and what are the effects of this language. And we did this by starting from the observation of actual linguistic uses. So in other words, the whole idea was to bring the discipline of rhetoric in the context of robotics. In our modern society, rhetoric is often reduced to eloquence, or worse, it's considered in a caricatured form of manipulation. But according to Aristotle, the discipline of rhetoric is the art of finding the available means of persuasion in a given case. So rhetoric is firstly a technique of discovery and invention of arguments, which include the cognitive and linguistic tasks that consist in passing from general concepts and ideas to speaking and acting accordingly in a particular case. And this is with such a conception of rhetoric inherited from Chaim Perelman and Lucy Olbrecht-Iteka, who founded the School of Rhetoric of Brussels, where I myself studied, that we formulated the questions of this research project, which were the following ones. So how do we humans read robotics? Why do we use certain words and not others that would maybe seem more appropriate when we talk about technical aspects, when we talk about machines? Then what does the lexicon used to talk about robots tell us about the way that we, humans, perceive moving machines? And finally, could we find alternatives if we wanted to? So could we talk about robots differently than what we do now when we use these words spontaneously? And in this way, and like I said before, the main idea of the project was to better understand how humans perceive and talk about robots from their own stance. And to these questions, you are probably wondering if we found answers. So to the first one, why do we use certain words to talk about robots and not others? So the reasonable answer is probably we don't know exactly. But we managed to show that movement plays an important role in that aspect. And I think we all know how excited Jean-Paul was when him and I realized that movement might have something to do with this. So in fact, we explained the use of these words that we call the agentive lexicon through the problem of the ineffability of motion. Ineffability being the difficulty or impossibility of putting certain experiences into words. So a natural language is supposedly capable of expressing all our sensations, perceptions, abstractions, etc. But in fact, no purely verbal language ever entirely achieves total affability. So as an example, think of having to describe in words alone the smell of rosemary, for instance. Now, motion can be described in many words, since it can be appreciated by visual perception, but also through the sense of touch. So we commonly qualify movement as being smooth, for instance. And yet, a strong struggle, or at least feeling of struggle, remains when it comes to actually formulate movement into words, so to code movement linguistically. But because we must still express the situation, we instead describe actions and dispositions. So, for instance, we say a tennis player hit the ball, rather than the tennis player raised his right arm, made a dynamic movement from up to down, etc. So motion can be translated to natural language, but we simply don't do it. In the context of robotics, motion raises the same problem of ineffability, and the agentive lexicon, again, enables to bypass that problem, as we can then quickly and efficiently describe a situation with a robot. So in rhetorical terms, we say that this language produces the effect of enargeia. It makes actions visible. In other words, it creates an effect of clarity, and in this way it fulfills the primary function of language. The discourse shows more than it tells. On the other hand, when we say something as simple as, for instance, the robot doesn't want to go to the other side of the room, the effect of enargeia brings for sure clarity and is efficient, but it also brings persuasive effects that might be felt as inconvenient for researchers who are trying to introduce robots in their technical aspects, for example. And I'm sure you all have experience with this already. But considering the role of movement and the problem of ineffability that it raises, surely unable to observe that the words of robotic, the adjunctive lexicon, is extremely hard to avoid, or at least it's hard to avoid when we express ourselves spontaneously. And this is hard to avoid whether we believe that a robot is intelligent or not at all, whether we have more or less an affinity to anthropomorphism. So when we come to ask, could we talk about robots differently? Should we use alternative words in order to avoid any confusion between the living and the machines? It's probably interesting to consider that while we have a lot to gain in thinking and choosing finely the words that we use to talk about robots, the matter of the language of robotics goes beyond that semantic level. It concerns the discourse in its whole, and even more than that, it concerns our epistemology of language and our relation to our own representations. So in that sense, our ability to debate constructively about robotics and to discuss plausible societal problems that might come with the development of new technologies depends rather on our ability to revisit our own relation to language and representations than on agreeing about the words we use and the way we define them. Now, that's where Jean-Paul would tell me, okay, so what? And I could not make this presentation without mentioning this because he said it to me so many times, while giggling a bit, because he would know I would come to his office being very proud of myself that I finally have a sort of clear conclusion, and he would just like to tease me and say, okay, so what? So, in fact, this so what is what I tend to explore in my current research at the University of Vienna, where I focus on the problem of responsibility in the context of robotics and AI. So surely there's a general interest in being able to conduct constructive discussions in order to prevent potential risks and ethical issues related to technology. And while, for instance, Rodney Brooks regrets that mistaken extrapolations distract us from thinking more productively about the futures, this is a reference to his 2017 work. He also highlights the problem of limited imagination when it comes to ethical reflection. And by the way, the state of the art in practical ethics is quite unanimous on this point. So firstly, there's a call for defining, assuming, and exploiting our imagination as a tool in this context. And beyond that, this is a call for more likelihood or plausibility within our practice of imagination about technology and the future. But how do we exercise imagination, and how exactly does it serve the ethical reflection about robotics? So I aim to research this problematic using again the discipline of rhetoric as a heuristic method. So concretely, this means that I wish to conduct an experiment where roboticists and specialists in narrations, writers, screenwriters, illustrators, are gathered around a same creative task, a narrative exercise. And Philippe already did one at the Cité des Sciences in 2018. He knows it's possible and not horrible to do this exercise. So if there is any volunteer for this experience, let me know. But so what I wish to explore with this are the following questions. What do we consider as being plausible or not? On the basis of which criteria do we decide if one or another scenario is likely to be real or not? And knowing that, of course, influences how we will spend our energy and resources to prevent certain risks and not others. Also, how are the criteria of likelihood different to experts in the field of robotics and AI than to specialists in narration? And this is a way of understanding how fiction and reality intermingle with each other and how one could serve the other. And finally, what are the eventual advantages in reconsidering the role of imagination and fiction in ethics of technology, compared to the formulation of ethical principles and rules that researchers and also entrepreneurs are invited to follow through regulations, guidelines, codes of conduct, recommendations, etc. Because as Mark Johnson reminds us in Moral Imagination, while moral principles and rules have a role to play, because they encapsulate our past experience, we should engage in an open dialogue about them. So morality, according to Johnson, is not a system of laws, but an imaginative exercise based on what we share with others. I can now thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to answer your questions if you have any.